horror writer and a scaredy cat, discuss the cinematic history of Dracula.
Hi, I'm Avishai. I am the horror writer in question.
And I'm Michal, and I'm the scaredy cat. So, Avishai, what are we doing here?
So, there's a new Nosferatu movie coming out as of the time of this recording. We're recording this on December 3rd, and on December 25th, known to the Christians as Christmas.
I've heard of that.
Yeah. They are releasing Robert Eggers' new version, and in anticipation of that, we thought wouldn't it be fun to look at the very, very, very long history of this particular... Is franchise the right word? I feel like it's kind of the wrong word here.
I thought you were going to say character, actually.
Is character the right word?
Maybe not. I think that's what's interesting about this is that it's not just one thing, right? Like, it is something that is clearly, like, Dracula / Nosferatu is clearly defined by almost more visuals than anything else.
Yeah, it's what if we took an actual book that an actual person wrote that is very defined on the page and kind of spun off of an interpretation of that without actually having to be married to that, and in doing so, redefining that.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the book we're talking about is Dracula by Bram Stoker. Yeah. I mean, you probably know that, but you know.
Rest in peace, King.
Yeah, so basically our plan is to kind of go through the cinematic history of Dracula. We're gonna, we'll be watching each new installment, or not new, actually, sorry, I'm gonna start that again. So our plan is basically to, go through the cinematic history of Dracula. We will be, watching movies. Avishai, as the horror writer, has curated a very nice and terrifying selection of films for us to watch, and we'll be discussing them, comparing them, probably referring regularly to the Eggers version once we see it. And we also have a couple of exciting segments that are...
Yeah. We're going to be looking at Dracula and vampire films through the lens of Nosferatu specifically, and the ways that this particular 1922 silent film has basically cast a long shadow of its own that is inseparable from Dracula, but it's also kind of distinct from it, and sort of its own off-brand flavor that has kind of become its own brand in a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really fascinating. We'll get into some of that history in a minute. But yeah, as we said, our first episode is starting off at the beginning, the very, very beginning, 1922's Nosferatu.
1922's Nosferatu, the German silent film directed by F.W. Murnau, produced by Albin Grau. I might be mispronouncing things, but that's because I'm American, and it's not my fault. We just weren't educated this way. So should we start getting into the history? Kind of talk about what this is? Yeah, so Albin Grau, the producer, really, he was into the occult. He was very into the occult. In World War I, he heard stories about actual vampires while on the front lines.
Mm-hmm.
He talked to local farmers who said, like, oh yeah, my father rose from the dead and became a vampire and killed some people, and we had to put a stake through his heart. And ever since then, Grau was really excited about one day making a vampire movie. And he really wanted to adapt Dracula, which he could not get the rights to.
Oops. Even in 1922, these things were complicated.
And for context, Dracula was a relatively recent book. Dracula was written in 1897, and Nosferatu eventually came out in 1922. So it's a very short period away. It wasn't quite the established, endless franchise that it is now. And also, there hadn't actually been any other films based on it that we know of. There are some rumblings that there was a Russian film that just doesn't exist anymore, may not have ever existed, but that's sort of besides the point. Albin Grau wanted to adapt Nosferatu, couldn't get the rights, did it anyway.
And speaking of not existing, apparently this version of Nosferatu that we have today, we're pretty lucky that we have the ability to watch it even.
Yeah. So they hire the writer Henrik Galeen, who wrote the... Henrik Galeen, a Jew, by the way,
hey.
who wrote Der Golem, and they hired him to write a screenplay based on Dracula, but not too based on Dracula, so that they can skirt some IP laws. So all the names are a little different, including Dracula, who in this film is Count Orlok. Jonathan Harker is Thomas Hutter. His wife Mina is Ellen Hutter. Renfield is Knock.
Van Helsing is the Paracelsian.
The Paracelsian Dr. Bulwer. And it kind of, kind of gets, I could see why they thought this could help them get around things. They changed the plot a little bit too, but not very much. And the prints that were released did say at the beginning based on the novel Dracula, which wasn't.
That won't help your case.
Listen, they were new at the concept of movies, but yeah, no. F.W. Murnau directs this movie. Who he would go on to be known as one of the great German silent directors. He's very well known for the film Sunrise, Tale of Two Humans, which they made us watch at NYU during film school. Wonderful movie. I have to rewatch it again to see how it quite comports with modern gender politics, but it's quite a wonderful movie. He directs this movie, changes the plot in some subtle ways, keeps it the same as Dracula in some very broad ways. It's released. Bram Stoker's widow is very unhappy, sues, wins, and the court orders every copy destroyed. But some copies survive because they didn't quite have that same copyright issue in America, and there were still some copies of Nosferatu out there. So this becomes a cult classic over the century.
But one of the interesting things is that we don't have the full original experience, right? Like the title cards when you watch it, or the inter cards, whatever those are called in silent films, are in English, obviously. We don't have the original score or soundtrack that would have played. So it's we can come close to appreciating what people experienced when they watched Nosferatu for the first time, but not exactly.
Yeah, this movie has a very interesting life over the next century, both as a nearly lost film, an unauthorized film, and just as a film. It's hard to preserve film, especially before people quite realized how important film preservation was. So it starts to kind of get scattered to the winds a bit. You have all sorts of different copies that are missing scenes. You have copies with different intertitles that change the names of characters and actually make them closer to Dracula. So you actually do have some copies swirling around, which Orlok is Dracula, and so on and so forth. And they're also kind of at the wrong speed, because silent film of that era was cranked at a different speed than later film, and running it through the projector, they didn't quite adjust. And so for the longest time, the versions people watched, a little bit too fast, a little bit herky-jerky, a little grainy, a little off in these ways. And you have all
kind of imagine like a Charlie Chaplin piano soundtrack to it sometimes.
Yeah, and you also get a whole bunch of different. There was an original score, because as my film teacher at the film school in Jerusalem liked to say, silent film was never silent. There was always music, up until the moment where they actually paradoxically added sound, at which point they forgot for a moment that you're supposed to have music as well. But yeah, there was a score, but that score for the longest time wasn't what people really had access to at home. So you have all sorts of interesting. There are versions that are kind of library scores. There's versions that employ music from like The Blob, for example. Or generally like just public domain music, because this was a public domain movie and people who wanted to turn a quick buck could easily just release this on VHS with whatever cheap copy they wanted, and that's how people saw it for a century, and it became a sort of an underground classic pretty quickly. I'm gonna say like around the 60s when it started being shown again. It started to kind of pick up an audience, because even played at the correct speed, which is how we have it now. There've been many restorations, and there's a more modern restoration that restores the original speed and the quality and whatnot. It's an eerie movie. Now imagine watching that eerie movie where people don't quite move right, and there's a haze to it and kind of a grain to it. And Robert Eggers likes to talk about this. So when he saw it as a kid on VHS, you couldn't quite see the bald cap and the grease paint, and it just looks like a vampire. And so it lives rent-free in a lot of people's minds for a very long time.
And it's a very striking design. I mean, we'll talk more about some of the implications of Orlok's design, but I wouldn't say that, out of context, it's like terrifying, but it's certainly striking.
It's a very artful movie. It's a very intentional movie with a lot of thought that goes into actually like the aesthetics of it. It's not just adapting what existed at the time. It's not just reflecting current style designs. It's its own thing, and there's definitely a lot to talk about there.
Mm-hmm. So a quick rundown of Nosferatu 1922. Basically takes place in Germany. Our hero is Thomas Hutter, who is sent to Transylvania by apparently his employer, although that's not entirely clear in the film. It kind of felt to me like he was just his real estate agent.
Yeah, so Thomas Hutter is a real estate attorney, and he is told by his most likely boss, a wily little man with puffs of white hair on the sides of his head, who seems to be kind of already in league with Orlok. There's a contract written in Enochian. So to give a little context, to kind of give a digression to the digression. So Albin Grau, the producer of this movie, very into the occult, creates a production company specifically to make movies that get into the occult. That company, Prana Films, only makes one movie. It's this one. But there's a lot of inside baseball occult stuff in this. So the contract that Nock has received from Orlok, or has drafted for Orlok, it's a little unclear, about these houses that Orlok would like to buy in Wisborg, Germany, the fictional town of Wisborg, is written in Enochian, which is the language that the occultist John Dee claimed.
I know about John Dee.
There you go. What can you tell us about John Dee?
He was Queen Elizabeth's doctor and her spiritualist. He thought he spoke to angels. He had a whole paranormal experience.
Wow. Well, that's how he discovered Enochian.
Yeah. Discovered.
The written language of the angels.
Oh, okay.
And so that's what this text is. It's very authentically...
Which hand do you think of their several did the angels write with?
I like to imagine they're just all holding the same pen with all their hands. Just like stirring it around, like hoping to get it right.
Yeah.
It doesn't look like it functions very well as a language. There's like pentagrams and Jewish stars and swastikas. It's very strange.
It is.
But yeah, go on with the description.
Yeah, so basically, Hutter, who by the way, of course, has a lovely wife, Ellen.
With a lovely neck.
Yes, with a very lovely neck. And she's playing with a kitten in the first, opening shots of the movie, which immediately charmed me. But he goes to Transylvania to, I guess, seal the deal with Count Orlok. Along the way, he stops in a Transylvanian village, where the villagers do as villagers do when they hear that he is going to visit Count Orlok, and they're like, no, don't do that. He doesn't listen. And he finds a book in his hotel room, inn room.
Yeah, so the villagers always know when there's a big scary.
I think this is one thing we should keep track of. Do the villagers know, and do they listen to the villagers?
Yeah, as you had mentioned earlier, this is probably the first example in a movie of the happy-go-lucky man from civilization who's going off to the wilds of Eastern Europe to visit the Dracula there, and stops at an inn or a tavern and says, "I'm going to meet the Dracula," and everybody at the tavern says, "What?"
They literally stop and do the face thing.
You have so you're the scaredy cat. So you haven't seen An American Werewolf in London.
I have not.
Classically, the Americans stop at a tavern called the Slaughtered Lamb, where they're warned about the werewolf. So it's a thing. And
do they listen to the villagers?
It doesn't go great. But here Thomas Hutter is warned, and not only is he warned, he's given a very handy handbook about how vampires work, and all the rules of vampires, and even their lineage and how they're created by the demon Belial and all of that. And he just kind of laughs and tosses it.
Yep, he throws the book down.
He throws the book.
He does take it with him, though.
He does take it with him.
I guess he doesn't have much else to read on the way.
He throws it to make a point, and then picks it up and puts it in his bag. But by the way, it's worth mentioning, just from a media literacy standpoint, that performance in silent film is very different than performance in modern film and sound film, because it's not quite meant to be a representation of reality.
Mm-hmm.
It's theatrical, it's stage, and it's kind of a mix of stage and pantomime, because again, there's no dialogue, and so everybody's makeup is really heightened. It's all supposed to showcase their features, and they're going big. They're playing to the cheap seats. It's not quite about nuance. It's really about broadcast, and it's interesting watching over a century how performances evolve to become more about realism and naturalism, and things that aren't realism and naturalism but kind of resemble it to people who are used to watching movies. But I will say that in my film school, my early years there, a teacher did show us some silent films, and the kids just did not get it. Like it's easy to make fun of silent films.
Yes.
It's easy to make fun of silent films. It's not quite fair to the silent films, because they're not that's not their intention. We're kind of saying that they are failing at doing something that they did not intend to do. But
and they're translating, especially at this point, directly from theater. They're basically trying to do theater without sound, which is one of the benefits of live theater, and this is kind of how they compensate for that.
Yeah, and even though you do have the burgeoning Hollywood system in America, where you actually do have career film actors starting to rise up, you don't quite have that so much in Europe at the time. So you have a lot of theater actors here. Like, everybody's kind of done theater here, including, by the way, as Thomas Hutter actually goes to meet him, the performer of Count Orlok, Max Schreck, who we know very little about.
This is fascinating to me.
Yeah. We do know that he was an accomplished stage actor and did some films, but because it's not like he had a Wikipedia page. There were long legends and rumors, kind of inspired in part by the lack of what we knew about him, and also those old grainy prints we talked about, that maybe he was an actual vampire. And down the line, we'll talk about the movie they made about that. But Max Schreck, whose name means the most scream, an actual theater actor. But I digress.
Yeah. So Hutter arrives at a castle in Transylvania. He's overtaken by a man driving a very speedy carriage. And this was actually really fascinating to see how they sped the carriage up through the hills. I don't know how they did that, but it certainly wasn't as easy as it is today.
Yeah, well, they're trying to portray, the Carpathian Mountains as the land of phantoms, mm-hmm. right? Like they say that in the film, it's the land of phantoms, which is a very, quote unquote civilized Europe view of quote unquote uncivilized Europe, of out there is where, the rules of science don't quite apply yet. Mm-hmm. And it's all very sort of wild, and there's weird shit. Yeah. There's a werewolf that we see at one point in the movie that is quite literally actually just a hyena.
Yeah, we had a debate about this because I was like, there's no way they got a hyena. And Avishai was like, no, that's a hyena. And it turns out it was a hyena.
It's a hyena. And I'm not totally sure what their intention was there. Did they get a hyena because they needed a werewolf, couldn't quite create a werewolf with special effects, didn't quite want to put the money there, didn't quite want to invent the special effects for it, and people didn't know what a hyena looked like? Or were they like, hell yeah, we can get a hyena, people love hyenas?
I mean, I'm just so curious was it from a zoo? It's also the chillest hyena. It's the intercard is just intertitle is just and the hyena, and the werewolf, it's the scary thing. And it's just moseying along in the grass.
It's pretty cute, but the horses are spooked. And by the way, just history of film, the concept of editing as a technique, super new, right? This is the era of Sergei Eisenstein, and just the notion of, if you put two images together, they create a third idea.
Mm.
So if you have a hyena and then you have horses running, surely they're afraid of the hyena, which is, it's cool just watching the evolution of this. But yeah, no, Hutter has to stay the night at this hotel with the villagers because there's a werewolf out there, but then the next morning it's fine. And anyway, so he's picked up by a speedy
carriage. Spoiler alert, it's Count Orlok. And he goes to his castle. And, he explores the castle. I believe they talk that night, right?
Yeah. So nobody else is willing to take Hutter to the castle, right? And eventually, he's picked up by this phantom with the horses that are also covered in black fabric, and this figure is very clearly Orlok in disguise. But then Orlok kind of drops him off, runs, does a costume change, opens the door. We should describe Orlok. I can't imagine people are listening to Nosferatuesdays without a mental image of Nosferatu, but let's do it.
Yeah, okay. So let's pull up this picture here. So I think the first thing that jumps out at me is actually the hands. He's got he's holding his hands in such a way that they look almost multi-jointed, more than they should be. And the nails are kind of long enough and curved enough to look like they are part of the digit as well.
Yeah, he has finger extensions. He has talent.
Yeah, he's been to the salon or not.
He hasn't been to the salon in millennia. But yeah, no, it's a design that's really built for silhouette. He's tall, he's thin, he has these sloping shoulders. He wears a long overcoat with a trillion buttons that go down the middle.
Button game is strong.
The button game is strong. He's a bald man with bushy eyebrows, wide open eyes, pointy ears.
Enormous ears.
And his fangs aren't the classic Dracula fangs that we'll kind of come to know. They're not they're not kind of off to the side. They're the front two teeth, like a rat. He's very rat-coated. And fun fact about him, he only blinks once in the entire movie.
Oh.
Yeah, only once.
This picture that we're looking at, his eyes are popping out.
Yeah, maximum shriek here. He's got a strong scare game, but it's also, the thing that's so. And part of why I think this movie casts such a long shadow, is, I've made that joke before, is the way he moves. It's how he looks, but it's how he moves. He doesn't feel like a guy who they cast in a movie to play a vampire. He kind of feels otherworldly in how he stands, how he moves, the steps he takes, the way he raises his arms. The fact he kind of doesn't, he doesn't have a looseness to him. He's very stiff.
Very rigid. Yeah.
He kind of moves his whole body at once. From the very beginning. Hutter seems really oblivious to this. But they have a nice little chat. Orlok has a nice spread out for him, which, I love that in almost every adaptation of Dracula, this guy who lives alone in the boonies where people won't even deliver. And it's a guy who does not eat. He's got
he eats. He just doesn't eat food.
Well, he just doesn't eat food. He has to be a good cook, right? He has to put out the spread that isn't alarming to Hutter, and he gives him food that Hutter seems to like, and it's a fascinating little quirk that always happens with Nosferatu and Dracula, of this guy who does not eat and who is the most isolated who's ever been has to have a really good cooking game.
He also has some decor that is worth noting, like the skeleton clock.
He has a skeleton clock. It's the cutest cuckoo clock. It looks like a skeleton. It
doesn't really look like it's like a clock with a skeleton on it, a teeny tiny skeleton on it.
Like an Art Deco skeleton.
Yes.
I want to know where he bought that because I want that clock. But yeah, no, he's chilling with Hutter. They're discussing the real estate contract, which Orlok reads over as if it's the first time he's reading it, which makes me think that Nock wrote something in Enochian.
I guess, some code or this guy has a beautiful wife with a beautiful neck.
Let's get to that, right? Because Hutter does a couple of things that kind of set off Orlok, right? First, he accidentally cuts his finger.
Right. Yeah, this is the sexiest scene in the movie.
Orlok has such eyes for Hutter.
Yeah, he's very excited by the sight of his blood.
Yeah, a little tiny prick on his finger. And he also sees Hutter has a locket with a picture of Ellen, his lovely wife with, as Orlok says, a lovely neck, who warned Hutter not to go because she had a premonition because she's slightly psychic.
I think that might be something else we should keep track of. Do people pay attention, or do people listen to Ellen/Mina?
We always know.
No. We're 0 for 1 right now, and I don't think that score is going to get much better.
Yeah. I mean, again, this is the first Dracula adjacent film. So, they're setting a whole lot of ground, but man, Hutter should have listened. But yeah, no, Orlok kind of starts to fuck with Hutter. Hutter wakes up in the morning having slept in his chair, which is a thing he seems to like to do, and has a couple of pinpricks in his neck.
Yeah, and then he writes a letter to Ellen, and he's like, I got the weirdest mosquito bites. One right next to the other.
I'm in a land of horrors, and I have a wound on my neck, but do not worry. But yeah, he wanders the castle, and Orlok's not around.
Yeah,
right. He's not around during
because
the day.
This is daytime now. It's worth noting that all of the nighttime scenes are shot day for night, and I found it actually very difficult to discern the difference.
Yeah. So here's the thing that was more apparent in the original print and in the most recent restoration prints, and not apparent for nearly 100 years in between. So they couldn't quite film night for night if they wanted to get the proper light exposure for this kind of film. So there's a lot of filming during the day. But the way
good for the crew, bad for the movie.
Yeah, but the way that they would differentiate was through tinting, and this is something that audiences at the time understood. If something was tinted kind of yellow, it was daytime. If it was tinted blue, it was night. So there's a lot of stuff in here that was shot in the day that's tinted blue, that takes place at night, and for nearly 100 years, the tint was lost, and so all you really had was just a full black and white print with no coloration to differentiate between day and night. And so you get a lot of inconsistencies about whether this vampire is able to be out in the sunlight.
Exactly. Which is an important part of the lore, obviously.
Yeah.
So, meanwhile, back in Wiesburg.
Fictional town of Wiesburg.
Ellen is, not in a great mood. She's sitting sadly by the sea on the beach. She keeps having, nightmares.
It's a beautiful beach cemetery.
Yeah, it's a cemetery on the beach. I think this is another visual to keep track of, but it's weird. Ellen's not okay. They keep calling the doctor for her.
Ellen's not okay, and she seems to already be under the influence of Orlok, who is still way off in Transylvania, but because he's seen her picture.
Evidently, that's the only connection.
Yeah, he's seen her picture. He seems to have developed a mild obsession with her, and suddenly, way back in Wiesburg, she's already under a spell. It's a very powerful. So something I want to point out about this also. This discards a lot of vampire lore from Dracula, because again, trying to kind of chart its own path, and that means kind of redefining what the rules are, right? And one of the changes kind of pointed out early on. It doesn't seem that Orlok is a vampire who was created by another vampire or can create vampires, right? We're sort of aware of that as a trope, right? A vampire bites you and potentially you drink his blood or her blood and then you become a vampire as well. That kind of spread doesn't exist in this movie. And if anything, it's implied that Orlok was a goetic sorcerer. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
Oh my goodness.
Because it says that...
I missed that implication somehow.
Well, I had to do some reading about this, right? Because it mentions Belial, right? The demon Belial has essentially created Orlok. And if you look into Grau's occultism and that kind of world of academia, so to speak, there was an idea that, goetic, I'm probably pronouncing this wrong, but goetic sorcerers would try to contact Belial specifically. That was the demon, Satan's right-hand man. That's the one that they would try to consort with and get their power from. And so by mentioning Belial, that implies that that's what Orlok did, that he got powers from this particular demon. It's an interesting new wrinkle because again, Grau, F.W. Murnau is the the artistic mind behind this movie, but Grau's the mind behind the concept of how the vampires in this work. He wants it to be consistent with what he believes, or at least what he purports to believe. So this version of Orlok is not a species, so to speak, and yet he kind of acts like one.
He does, yeah.
He's predatory, and he's very rat-like. There's a big rat visual motif in this movie. He sleeps in coffins that have rats in them. He
has a lot of coffins, by the way, just like a whole bunch.
Yeah, when he decides to actually move to Wisberg, he gathers up his many coffins of dirt, which are labeled at the dock as having dirt for exploratory reasons, like botanical experiments. It's so many coffins.
It's weird.
And he gathers them up in stop motion.
Yes.
Just to kind of make it feel otherworldly.
And obviously he's like barely holding them, so it's like, yeah, the effect is very cool.
Oh, this Orlok is also, telekinetic. He opens doors with his mind. He can turn invisible. He can phase through
He does
things.
have to walk through Wisberg once he gets there, like holding a coffin, though. And like, I was honestly very impressed by Max Schreck, just like holding the coffin.
And then he phases through a wall with one of them.
He does.
Yeah. But we're getting ahead of ourselves.
We are getting ahead of ourselves. So basically, at a certain point, Hutter picks up that something's going on. I believe he finds the coffins. And he's like, you know what, I'm out of here. So he makes use of our good friend rope made of sheets.
Oh, yeah.
And tries to escape the castle. And he sees Orlok leaving, right? And he's like, I have to get back home before he
he at this point he's picked up that Orlok's a vampire. Like, he saw him like dead in a coffin, and like Orlok's gone out the door.
He has the book.
And he consults the book.
Yeah.
He's like, oh, the book has actually some relevant information here. But yeah, he basically tries to race Orlok home. He gets delayed a bit because he has to be taken care of by like
a nun. Yeah, he gets sick. Question mark.
He did have his blood drained.
He did.
A mild thing. But then he's essentially racing Orlok home. He's going by land, and Orlok's going by sea.
Yes. And Orlok, he takes the watery route. And things don't go well for the ship that he boards. It's funny because the other vampire movie that I have seen is The Voyage of the Demeter, The Last Voyage of the Demeter. And it was very funny to see that entire, hour and 40-minute movie just compressed into like 2 seconds.
Yeah.
But yeah, basically all the crew members sicken, they die, and the captain ties himself to the wheel.
Yeah. For context, The Last Voyage of the Demeter is a recent adaptation, 2023, I'm going to say.
Yeah, something like that.
Unless it was this year.
No, it wasn't this year. We saw it in the summer.
We're new at podcasts. Or I'm new at podcasts. It's an adaptation of a single chapter of the novel Dracula, in which Dracula travels to London from Transylvania and kind of picks off the crew of the ship that he's on. And the faithful illegal adaptation of Nosferatu is same thing happens here. We get that iconic shot of, as the captain's trying to, or one of the crew members is trying to hack open the coffins because they figured out it's the coffins. Mm-hmm. Orlok rises out of the coffin just straight like a bolt.
Yeah.
It's that's one of the great iconic images of horror. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the doesn't work out well for the crew. The intertitle tells us that the ship has a new captain now. Yes. Look at me. I'm the captain now.
Oh my god. So yeah, they end up, they do end up taking port in Wisberg, and kind of immediately a plague seems to break out. Like full on, like it's actually kind of funny because the wise men of the town are like trying to examine the corpse of the captain and figure out what happened, and then they're like, uh-oh, plague. So they just leave. So
this is something, by the way, to also keep track of,
mm-hmm.
because I've gotten ahead on the homework and I've seen some other adaptations of this, and there are some great versions of that scene.
I'm excited.
Yeah. But yeah, Hutter gets home kind of right before Orlok does to his wife, and then kind of does nothing. He's sort of like, well, at least I'm home. And once the plague breaks out, he doesn't, like, nobody quite knows to pin it on Orlok. Like, Hutter and Nock, which we'll get to in a second, are the only ones who kind of know that Orlok has set up shop. In a major deviation from the Dracula novel, Orlok is not a social creature.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't ingratiate himself with society and kind of pick
This
people
is not
off.
a sexy vampire. I guess we should have said that to start.
This is a deeply unsexy vampire.
I mean, unless you're into that, which you do you.
Yeah, we're not gonna fang shame. I tried to think of something cleverer than that, and I failed. Oh man, but yeah, no, it is mentioned that not only is he bringing dirt in his coffins from his homeland that he must sleep in, it is specifically Black Plague dirt.
Mm-hmm.
And he's got Black Plague rats, and people are dying of the Black Plague right and left in Visburg.
Yes, or they're dying of him, and it's being assumed to be the plague. That was sort of how I interpreted it.
It's sort of a blend, isn't it? Right?
Yeah.
Because it's not like they're quite going to show him going house to house and drinking people's necks, but also it's almost non-literal, or it's almost just sort of like the plague has arrived, he is the plague. Right, which could be a matter of he's casting a spell, or it could be a matter of he's drinking people's blood and people just don't quite realize. But you just have a parade of coffins after a certain point. Just an actual...
The imagery is very familiar as far as like what we would imagine like plague times to be. Like they're marking doors. There are like the endless coffins. There's a whole scene of people hearing like the town crier yell about plague and like are peering eagerly out their windows, and then they creep back and close their windows. There's a very cute little child in one of them.
It does feel like the filmmakers have lived through a pandemic.
I mean, Spanish flu. So
no joke. Mask up.
It's funny. There's a lot of relevant stuff in this ethos, this genre, I guess.
Yeah.
Of Dracula.
We should get to Nock.
Yeah. So Nock, cray cray. He really does basically lose it very quickly and ends up imprisoned. He tries to escape to find the master. He keeps talking about the master. He ends up leaving basically the whole town, it seems like, on a wild goose chase because he kills a guard, right, in his prison cell.
Yeah, he either kills him or knocks him out. It's not 100% sure.
I believe he also tries to employ rope made of sheets.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Little side note, a lot of adaptations of Dracula combine the Harker and Renfield characters, which we will talk about in future episodes about specific adaptations, but typically we'll only see one person go to the castle with a contract, and then that person will come back deranged and under the spell of the vampire. And in the novel, it was two characters, and so here it's two characters. Nock is the Renfield. He never interacts directly with Orlok in this movie. He's just, through his association with him that predates, the opening of the movie, he just goes mad, and he's in an asylum, which looks very classic asylum. It doesn't look like it's really meant to help anybody. He escapes. He's running around like a grinning goon, and the town has decided that he's the cause of the plague because he must be a vampire. Because look at that man, that man with the scariness to him,
and no racial coding whatsoever.
Yeah, the real estate agent with the bald head and puffs of hair and kind of a hook nose.
Also, the first time we see him, he's bending over a desk and he's like perched on this chair, and it is definitely where the Harry Potter designers got like the image of a goblin from, like 100%. It's jumping right out of there.
We will absolutely get into this,
yeah.
But it is interesting from a narrative standpoint that the town has decided that this plague is being caused by a vampire, and that Nock is the vampire, and that the fellows who, that the one person and his wife, so I guess they both know, Thomas and Ellen both know that Count Orlok has set up shop across the street from their house.
To be fair, no one's listening to anything Ellen says.
Right. Ellen is just falling on deaf ears. She is the most sane person in
She
this
keeps
movie.
fainting, walking on her toes.
Yeah, she's having a whole time. And Thomas, at this point in the movie, is kind of an absent protagonist.
Yeah.
His job is essentially done. He's come home to his house for comfort, and that's kind of that. And his wife is kind of pointing out, hey, that Orlok that you and I know is a vampire. I see him across the street staring at me from his window.
Remember the guy you sold the houses across the street to? He's there.
Oh, the guy that I saw load coffins onto a ship. I don't know what you're talking about. But we have to give a little bit of grace because of the era. But it's, by the way, side note, another digression. It's funny how many times things are explained by intertitles that have already been explained.
Yes.
Or have already happened. There's a lot of repetition, which is just an interesting thing to note narratively and structurally of 1922 silent German film.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean the plague is raging, and basically we kind of come to our climax.
Well, before we do, we get a nice little science lesson from
That's true.
from the Paracelsian.
Oh my god, how could I have forgotten the Paracelsian?
Our Van Helsing analog, who doesn't do very much in the way of Van Helsinging.
He really doesn't. He's genuinely a scientist in this.
Yeah, and he follows the teachings of Paracelsus. Paracelsus. Thank you. You know more about this than I do.
I think he was a doctor figure from, I want to say, Greece or Rome, ancient.
The humors. Yeah, but Dr. Bulwer, the Paracelsian, gives a nice little science lesson via stock footage, I guess, for scientific purposes, explaining Venus flytraps and spiders, and
it's basically the concept of being a carnivore.
Yeah, the concept of creatures feeding on other creatures, but not the creatures that we're super familiar with. So we have like microbes and whatnot.
And I guess the point of that also is the idea of like the lore, right?
Yeah.
And like how in the case of a Venus flytrap, a fly can just like settle on apparently a flower and then suddenly it's consumed. Same thing with a spider web. So I think that is maybe part of the psychological element that's going on there.
And Max Schreck does such a great job just embodying a creature that looks human and could kind of pass among humans, but is actually a predator to humans in disguise. Like it really is that uncanny feeling, and it's so eerie how he pulls it off.
I think it's really, not to dwell too much on his description, but like it's part of how ridiculous it is, because like at the core of it, you still have his eyes. His nose is a little crazy, but his eyes and his mouth, like I feel like, we'll see obviously what Robert Eggers pulls out with which Skarsgård is it again?
Bill
Skarsgård. But like we'll see, but like I anticipate that looking extremely realistic and extremely scary, but obviously this is not as realistic or not realistic, and yet somehow it does exactly blend what you were saying, like that idea of like you could see this person walking down the road and be like, oh, weird person.
Yeah, he's not designed to look undead. He's designed to look mutant.
Yes.
He looks like another species of creature dressed like a person. And that's a strong choice. It's a strong choice, especially since it discards every description of Dracula from the book. This is based on Alban Grau's idea of what a vampire should look like, based on what he has been told on the front lines and has read about since. So it's all about the word Nosferatu, right? It means vampire. Its etymology is kind of hard to trace, but you could kind of trace it back, I believe, to Romanian, and it means like the intolerable one, which is exactly what this design is. He is wrong.
Yeah, it's uncanny. It's not frightening.
Yeah, which is kind of why it is frightening.
Right, exactly.
Like he's not he's not putting on a scary face. He just, there's something in our animal brain that looks at that and says, there's something off about that. We need to leave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm actually thinking of like, I mean, I haven't seen any versions of this and I don't intend to, but I've seen the trailer for The Wolfman, which is coming out soon. And like, it feels like a contrast to that, you know?
Yeah. It's not, yeah, no, when we hear vampire, we tend to imagine either a very normal looking person with a secret, or we imagine something very sort of classically demonic,
Mm-hmm.
or something kind of zombie like.
Mm-hmm.
And what we have here is almost like a missing link between a rat and a human.
Mm-hmm.
And he never blinks, and he does not move in a normal way, and it's creepy. He's almost more of a demonic spirit in a lot of ways. Like, there are scenes where he's kind of translucent.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, he's come to Visberg and he's brought the plague.
Yeah.
And the only one who knows really about it is Ellen Hutter.
So his ears, sorry, just to go back to the description for a second, his ears are very bat-like, but there's no bat imagery in the movie that I recall.
Yeah, there's no bat imagery. Future versions of this story will bring the bat back into it.
Yeah.
But he's...
I mean, inextricably. Like, probably the first word that anyone would... Like, if you said Nosferatu or Dracula, they would say bat.
Yeah. Which, again, kind of shows the importance of being the first on the scene,
Mm-hmm.
right? When you are the first either adaptation or presentation of something that will eventually become, kind of a codified set of tropes, you don't necessarily get all those tropes in place.
Mm-hmm.
And here, like, there is a universe in which no other Dracula movies are ever made after this one, and our understanding of Dracula, so to speak, is a rat monster.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so they do catch Knock.
They do catch Knock. They throw him back in prison. And then Ellen ends up reading the book that Hutter found, which I guess is also in German.
Well, it's for the tourists, right?
Yeah, exactly.
welcome to Romania. Here's your guide to our woods.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, we have people like
Famous
you coming
locals.
through all the time. We have to prepare. But she discovers that a vampire can be defeated if a pure-hearted woman distracts the vampire with her beauty and offers him her own blood. So she's like, oh, I guess that's my role in this story.
Yeah, and Orlok's pretty clearly into her.
Oh, yeah.
So
She keeps seeing him through the window. Other people can't see him. It's like,
he's her neighbor.
he's her neighbor.
And he's saving her for last, apparently, because the town is essentially being wiped out.
Yes. For the people she stays with, she stays with while Hutter is away, I think die of the plague. It's a little vague, but one of them is definitely sick.
Yeah, no, it's going poorly for a lot of people. And she's pointing out her window saying, it's him, it's that guy. And people aren't really responding. And so she has to take matters into her own hands.
Mm-hmm.
She effectively eye fucks Orlok through the window. Says, come hither.
The second sexiest scene.
And Orlok has that wonderful moment where he's staring out the window and he's like, me? Now?
Yeah.
I'm coming right on over.
And he does. And he, she allows him to drink her blood. But she has timed it perfectly so that the sun rises just as he finishes. And he turns into dust.
Yeah. I should note that when he's actually approaching her, it's done in this really expressionistic way where he's casting these long shadows and he's interacting with the environment with shadows. He's opening the door with the shadow of his hand. He clutches her, I'm going to say heart, with the shadow of his hand.
Yes, he just straight up is groping her.
Yeah, no, he's all over her. But he essentially drinks her dry till dawn, realizes that he lost track of time, and is evaporated by the sunlight, which is the first time a vampire in media is killed by sunlight.
Mm-hmm.
That was not in the Dracula book. In the Dracula book, he just doesn't like being outdoors during the day because he's nocturnal and sort of lacking his full powers. But here, sunlight literally burns Orlok to nothing.
Yep. And I think Nock dies at the same time, right?
I don't think he dies. I think he's just kind of disappointed.
Oh, okay.
I think he just realizes, like, oh, I guess my master died. He never gets to meet him, which is very sad.
It's like the worst pen pal situation ever.
Yeah, imagine God, imagine having such fanatical feelings for somebody and being such an obnoxious person in the name of somebody who you will never meet.
Yep.
Could you imagine?
Oh.
Could you imagine being like that? Somebody who also, by the way, if you did meet, would probably not be very nice to you.
Yeah.
But it's okay. People aren't like that. It's fine.
Yeah. So Ellen dies, and just as Hutter arrives
with the Paracelsian.
With the Paracelsian, he's kind of good for nothing, but we didn't even really need his info dumps, but whatever. We got the word Paracelsian out of it, so I think that's fair.
Yeah. And it's one of the rare Dracula stories in which the Dracula is killed by the woman.
That's a good thing to know.
Yeah, let's keep track of that.
Yeah.
But this was your first time watching Nosferatu.
It was.
What was your feeling while watching it?
I think I was surprised at how, yes, like silly it felt, because there is a lot of silliness in it from our perspective, but also there are points where it does have a very emotional narrative. Like, honestly, I don't know. I don't think this was intentional, but I felt very bad for the Knock character. You know, you can kind of see how it provides so many it is such a rich text to work off of, and to mine and to elaborate elements of. And yeah, there were one or two shots in there that I would consider scary.
There are definitely some nightmare moments.
Mm-hmm.
Old film does have a very kind of dreamlike quality to it, and
yes.
And so watching Orlok standing in that arched doorway, a lot of arches in this movie, but standing in that arched doorway, just kind of emerging from the shadow and just staring, that's a nightmare image.
Yeah. I think it's also interesting to note that there is almost no explicitly Christian imagery in the movie, and certainly none that has anything to do with defeating Orlok.
This is very true, and that probably comes, again, from, the occultist intentions of the movie, right? It's not meant to reinforce any church.
Mm-hmm.
It's, it doesn't even really seem meant to reinforce any government. But it is, supposed to represent a supernatural reality that some people involved in it. I don't think Murnau believed in it, but Grau did.
Mm-hmm.
And Murnau, it's interesting watching this movie now in the context of other silent German films from that era, because silent German films from that era were very known for artifice, right? You have German expressionism, so there's a lot of, artificial sets that aren't designed to look realistic. They're all at canted angles, and the lighting is kind of built into it through the paint. And here you have a little bit of that, sure. When the sunlight comes up and kills Orlok, the buildings outside are pretty clearly painted. But generally speaking, this movie is filmed on real locations. They are out at a castle. They are out in the they are out in the woods.
They have a real hyena.
But it's interesting the extent they went to making it feel a form of realistic in an era and in a region, and in a trend in the moment where artifice was the point.
Mm-hmm. It's also a theme I was thinking of, which I feel like is important when you're talking about these stories, is the quote unquote modern confronting the eldritch and ancient and almost incomprehensible. And I think that's interesting because obviously the movie's filmed in 1922, or I guess it was filmed in 21 or whatever. But the story takes place in the 1800s. So we're already posing, it takes place in 1838 actually. So
way earlier than the novel, by the way.
Yeah. Thank you, Wikipedia. But so from 1922, they're looking back at an older time and being these people think they're so modern, but they're being confronted with this eldritch reality. And I kind of wonder if the writer wanted to play with that as somebody who maybe believed that the eldritch reality was more real than, I guess, what modern science would deign to understand.
That is interesting, especially since the scientists in this movie are so ineffectual.
Mm-hmm.
But this is also something to keep track of amongst all the different adaptations we're going to look at. The threat is a foreigner from an origin point that the storytellers deem less civilized.
Mm-hmm.
who is coming to town to ruin our civilization.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of things that could be read into that.
Why is this so relevant?
Yeah, and that's present in the novel and present in every version since. It is the alien, the alien who is being brought into our civilization, bringing their bad culture and their
disease,
and their disease, their bad hygiene, and and their bad religion, and wreaking havoc. And this one in this film, it's very much the actual literal plague. And I think it's probably a good time to get into the elephant in the room, which is, this is a movie from 1922 Germany, and there are certain certain aspects of this that presage a lot of Holocaust imagery.
Yeah. So this is a section we're gonna call Nosferatu. Hey. And I feel like this will probably be of different lengths and prominences. Those are weird words to use, but this section is going to vary depending on what we watch. But I think I do want to keep touching back to this as we go forward, because a lot of this is very integral in what people experience later in the real non-vampiric world.
Yeah. It's not quite clear to us what the storytellers really intended, in their hearts. For all we know, there's a lot of coincidence happening.
Remind me, was Murnau Jewish?
Murnau was not Jewish. He was gay.
Mm-hmm.
The writer, the writer Henrik Galeen was Jewish. So you do have voices in this where you could assume maybe they're not quite trying to push Nazi ideology or proto-Nazi ideology.
Mm-hmm.
But there could be stuff in the zeitgeist at the time that maybe they were unconscious of, because what is the design of Orlok in this movie? It is a hook-nosed man with rat-like attributes.
Mm-hmm.
He is invited by a very Jewish stereotype. Knock is, let's be real, Knock is very much a Jewish archetype. And, he's the sniveling, greedy real estate mogul.
Mm-hmm.
But Orlok has certain imagery to him as well, that does eventually come to be kind of prominent in Nazi propaganda down the line. If you look at, there's a specific Nazi propaganda movie from 1940, so a good while later, but not too long later, called The Eternal Jew,
mm-hmm.
which is fully just anti-Semitic propaganda by the government. And there are some shots that kind of do feel kind of pulled out of Nosferatu, of rats fleeing a sinking ship,
mm-hmm.
And we do have a lot of rat in this. And, the idea of, I'll say this, in Mein Kampf.
Which, to be fair, hadn't been written yet, right?
Let's find out, actually. When was Mein Kampf? Mein Kampf had not been written yet, but it would be written 3 years later.
Interesting.
And in Mein Kampf, Jews are described at one point as that race that fears the sunlight or shuns the sunlight.
Mm.
And again, Orlok is the first vampire to be killed by sunlight. So, there are some potential, we don't have its correlation or cause, but I would not be surprised if at least one person saw Nosferatu and in their mind made the connection. Because
one specific
person, but probably multiple.
Yeah.
And, because you look at certain anti-Semitic imagery from, posters and whatnot down the line, you could look at that and say, oh yeah, those are some vampires there.
Mm-hmm.
Those are some Orlokian vampires.
Yes. And you see it today in, anti-Semitic imagery.
Oh yeah, all the time. I mean, the Jew as the blood drinker
mm-hmm.
is, the blood label goes back, centuries.
Yes.
So just the notion.
I feel like we'll definitely get more into that at some point.
Oh yeah, no, the foreign being that lives out in the boonies amongst the uncivilized people, so to speak, who only comes out to drink your blood.
And is both separate and an imposition.
Separate from the people, but the villagers know not to go there. Mm-hmm. Has, their own written language.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This isn't us alleging intent.
No.
Or even saying like Orlok is by definition an anti-Semitic archetype, but it's there.
It's there, and I think it's very interesting to think that it did come from a Jewish writer and a very at the time marginalized director, because I think some of these things can kind of come from the not the top, but like they can be imposed or they can be seen as expressions of the experience of downtrodden people, and I feel like that might be some of what at least subconsciously is going on here. And then when that gets very literally appropriated, bad things can happen. And I don't know, not to make this podcast like too grand or anything, but I feel like there's a little bit of reclamation here.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because like on one hand, you have the archetype of the Jew who lusts after the Aryan woman, right? I mean, he very specifically is defeated because the Aryan woman was pure of heart, lets him have at her, and that's
not blonde.
Not blonde. This is true.
I think Hutter is blonde. It's hard to tell, but
Hutter is forgettable. But
he has actually a very punchable face.
Yeah, he's. I think Hutter is probably not my favorite Harker. But it's interesting also to look at the scene where the mob is chasing Knock because they immediately assume like, oh, he's behind this and he is to blame. And to a very limited degree, he is. Like, he's the one who establishes correspondence with Orlok at the beginning. But they're kind of off the mark there, right? He's not actually spreading the plague. He's sort of a red herring there. But they're chasing him, and you have a real the mob chases a scapegoat moment that ultimately doesn't actually help stop Orlok. It really has nothing to do with it.
No, it really doesn't. It's part of why that character feels sympathetic, even though he doesn't do anything to experience he doesn't act in a kind way. He doesn't, it does feel very much like he is at best mentally ill and being tormented through that. I mean, that's another lens you could definitely look at this through.
Yeah. I mean, God loves an underdog, right?
Yeah.
God loves somebody who's being pursued. And Knock is somebody who, at worst, invited the devil. Mm-hmm. So did Thomas.
I mean, yeah.
And at best, he's just kind of a mentally ill guy who's under the sway of an ancient evil sorcerer, Dracula.
Yeah. And in the middle, he's a guy trying to make a buck.
Yeah.
Through his business, which,
And the entire town chases him, and nobody looks at the really sketch guy who just moved in.
Yeah. There aren't quite pitchforks and torches, but I mean...
Well, those hadn't been invented yet.
That's true. It was only 1838.
Yeah.
But I do think it's interesting. I'm just looking on Wikipedia, and sorry, maybe we should have done some previous research, but the actor who plays Hutter, I kind of feel bad because he was he joined the Communist Party in Germany in 1921.
Oh.
And he had to spend the war in the Soviet Union.
Oh.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
I feel like that's probably very common for actors of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially in Germany. I mean, historically, you do have a lot of artists in Germany in that era who, during World War II were either murdered or had to flee. Fritz Lang left Europe because he did not want to do propaganda. He didn't want to be the sanitized. He didn't want to be the sanitized. Like, we'll let you live, but you got to make movies for us. Mm-hmm. Murnau, again, gay man, closeted, but everybody knew. He did get courted to America early enough. But yeah, what do we know about Max Schreck? Right. Since we're looking at Wikipedia right now. Oh, that picture of him as a normal person is
still kind of scary.
It's
his eyes. It's his gaze.
He's got the eyes for it. Maximum Shriek. Oh, but his actual name, Friedrich Gustav Maximilian Schreck.
So, I mean,
he picked and chose.
Yeah.
He knew what he was doing.
I bet this guy was Jewish. It doesn't say.
It's entirely possible. I have a suspicion that a decent number of cast and crew on this movie were Jewish. And, there was a very robust Yiddish film world at the time. Are
there any Yiddish films about vampires?
Yiddish films about vampires? No, but there are Yiddish silent films about demons.
Okay,
I'm
interesting.
gonna do some research on that and bring that up for a future discussion because that's something to really look into.
Excellent.
But yeah, no, I mean the the film era of Germany in the 1920s is sort of a different social world than what Germany would become, but you can see the
Well, I
seeds.
mean, and the Weimar Republic was trying to be more like this, right? Like more cultural, more open. Um, not to go all cabaret, but the idea is that was what was replaced by the extremely conservative Nazi Germany.
How many of the horses in this movie do you think actually served in the war?
Well, okay, I was thinking about that, but then the war ended in 1918,
Mhm.
so it's well, yeah, I guess they could have.
Yeah, I mean, you have to produce a movie before you release it.
Yeah,
Like, so, film in 1921 or so.
yeah. One last thing I wanted to ask you, because it was written by a Jew, was there any that you know of censorship, or like Freud was burned, in
Hmm.
the streets. Not Freud himself. Freud's works were burned. So I'm curious if there was anything like that.
I don't think that was the case with this movie. I'm curious now if there was anything with Der Golem. I mean, I think Der Golem incorporates enough Christianity that it's
Mm,
okay.
right.
But this movie didn't really get to be censored for that kind of reason because it had to be wiped out
Mm.
for
Oh, that makes
copyright
sense.
reasons,
So
right?
it's man, that's almost like a weird version of the immigrant story, right? Like it only survived because it came to the shores of America and like a couple of you know
Yeah,
remnants.
yeah. I do think over the years there were countries that banned Nosferatu for being too scary.
Mm.
I'm gonna look those up real quick.
Well, we'll get to that in this. Actually, maybe that's a good segue into what I'm calling our scare factor segment. And if you have any uh, ideas for a better title, let me know. But because I am the scaredy cat, I figured I would rate this film on a scale of, I guess, not scary to scary. Um, I would give this a solid 2, maybe a 1. I was not scared.
Out of 5 or 10.
Out of 10.
Okay. Yeah.
I
Well,
like I like room to gradiate.
yeah. Oh, I think you are the objective person to rate how scary this is. It takes a lot to scare me these days, but I will say that when I first saw this movie, it was I think back in high school. I saw it on YouTube,
Mm.
and it was kind of one of those undercranked copies, and it didn't have the original music. It had a different score to it, and there was something so unsettling about that score
Hmm.
because it wasn't like a horror score, but it was a little avant-garde and a little bit weird. And there have been versions that were, yeah, rock music or whatnot. But but there's something about watching your very first silent movie
Yeah.
at the wrong speed on the internet with music that wasn't quite from that era.
Well, that's the uncanny effect, really.
Yeah, and I have to say the uncanny does a lot for me.
Hmm.
Like it's one thing to have a jump scare where something jumps out of the frame, or a lot of the very classic, you know, things that a horror movie can do to get a rise out of us. Which can all be done well or all be done poorly. And then there's something
I'm
about
so scared for Nosferatu.
for the Eggers version.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. But there's something about landing in that realm where it's not quite scary, but it's off that gets me,
Hmm.
And so this kind of falls there, and there is some strong, striking imagery, like when he's drinking her blood,
Hmm.
and all you really see is she's lying in bed, and you just see like the kind of the top of his head kind of in the corner
Hmm.
in the dark. There's something almost like a cryptid,
Yeah.
sighting about that image that gets you, And we watched a 4K restoration where you can see that all the actors kind of have like fake mutton chops and
Hmm.
um, but yeah, I mean like the ghost carriage scene, for example, it feels wrong,
Yeah.
you know, and
No, I feel like if I had seen this as a child, I would have been very scared by
I sent you Patton Oswalt's thing about that.
it.
Patton Oswalt recalling seeing this as a child with a bunch of children because they just put it on TV. They just decided like, oh, a silent film can't possibly be scary. I can imagine it being kinder trauma for sure.
Oh yeah.
The film was banned in Sweden due to excessive horror.
Okay.
And also in China.
Okay. Is it still banned in China?
I think they unbanned it since then. But yeah, no, it's a very, it's an interesting movie to look at the history of just as a whole and look at it as a scary thing. Because I think part of the fear factor of it is the fact that it's a movie that kind of shouldn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
It was made illegally. It stars a lead actor who for the longest time people knew nothing about. For the longest time, you can only really kind of get these bootleg copies. It was poorly preserved. And also it's a silent film, like it doesn't, it has that kind of remove as well. And so there's something about it as a relic, like the kids these days are really into analog horror, which is designed to feel like VHS, right? Like something so scary about VHS, or like a cassette tape is so scary. Silent, scratchy film is, in and of itself is, it scratches the scary itch.
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
Yeah. I think that's a really cool thing to end on. I think like the idea of the ordinary and the strange kind of combining in this. And also honestly the idea of the concept of Dracula itself as almost like a germ, that spreads, and we will see the different ways it manifests, the different symptoms it displays,
Yeah, a physical malady too. That it is a demon who corrupts the flesh, and not just the spirit. Like that's interesting from a folklore perspective.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah.
All right. So, what will our next flick be?
Well, I'm thinking that for the time being, let's be chronological. Let's look. If this is the first unauthorized Dracula, let's look at the first authorized Dracula.
Okay.
1931. The Bela Lugosi movie. Oh. I'm wearing him on my shirt right now.
Avishai, you should know, always themes his t-shirts.
I have 2 Bela Lugosi shirts and one Orlok shirt, and the collection will only grow. But I'm thinking we're going from a German film, a low budget, by the way, for F.W. Murnau movies. Like he would go on to do these big lavish productions, but Nosferatu was a low budget movie for him by an independent production company that had one movie and then died. Let's go into the sound era and see the first big Universal Studios monster movie hit that was filmed in studios, that had a very long life, and kind of redefined the tropes, and also, by the way, owes something to Nosferatu, which is an interesting thing to look at, because I think after a certain point, even if you're making a Nosferatu movie, because I feel comfortable saying that Nosferatu is probably the most influential horror movie ever made. It is one of the oldest horror features, and it is one that is referenced and picked up upon time and time and time again. And also, after a certain point, you can't really make any future Nosferatu movies without also living in the shadow of the Bela Lugosi one.
Right.
And as we are building up to the Robert Eggers adaptation, I think let's see all of the ancestors.
Yeah. Okay. Well, all right. So up next is 1931's Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi. I'm hoping that like some of this education will help me be less scared in the Eggers version, so I can just do like the Leo pointing meme, like I recognize that.
Well, I'm going to make a prediction. As we go through the list, you will not be scared until you are.
Great. I've never seen a Robert Eggers film, so I know. I mean, I've seen a lot of The Witch as far as like talk about anti-Semitic tropes, but I've seen a lot of The Witch in like YouTube clips and things. But I have never seen the full film.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a sneak preview for our discussion when we finally get to that movie is just how much Robert Eggers he really cares about historical fidelity, even in the folklore, and how his approach to the vampire won't just be his take on Murnau's and Grau's and Galeen's and Schreck's Orlok, but also the historically quote unquote accurate Eastern European vampire lore. It'll be interesting to see how he does that.
I'm actually excited for that. What does real quote unquote Dracula look like according to Robert Eggers?
And yet the prototype cinematic vampire is a tall, bald man with pointy ears, pointy teeth, long fingers, a lot of buttons, and eyes that do not blink.
All right, should we end each? Should we sign off with "Don't blink"?
I think we should sign off with like a phrase that really stood out to us in the movie, like a line or a moment, like
okay,
like a line.
Yeah. I just keep thinking of Ellen just for some reason shouting "Hutter," like she doesn't know her own husband's first name. I know that's not terribly thematic, but you know.
So why don't we end with like I'll say a line and we'll just say Hutter.
Okay, go for it.
Until next time, she has a lovely neck.
Hutter!
Take care.
Bye.